You're welcome to this lecture. This lecture is a follow-up of the other lectures, and it is going to be a continuation, but let me try to build a bridge. The last lecture we had was about just a general overview of the textbook that has been assigned for this course, and I tried to show you the different aspects of social welfare history. Today, in this lecture, I have decided to focus on one chapter which is going to be dealing with issues of social welfare history between the pre-Civil War period, which means 1777 to 1860. So remember that the Civil War started in the early 1860s and it ended in 1865. So what we're trying to do here is to look at what was happening in the United States between the Revolution and 1860 when the Civil War started, or around the time the Civil War was about to start. It is important to understand the Civil War that was fought in the United States because the American Revolution and the Civil War are two important periods in American history that you want to take note of. So what we're going to do now is to look at what are some of the social welfare issues or the issues related to social welfare history between 1777 and 1860. Now, to be frank, we will not be able to examine everything because of time constraint. So I'm just going to highlight certain things. The things I'm going to highlight are not exhaustive, but one of the logic that informed my selection of the topics that we're going to be looking at is the fact that when you meet as a social worker with your client or with somebody who needs your attention, one of the things we discussed in the previous lectures is to understand what are the broader social circumstances at the micro or meso level that brought you together. In other words, if I were to end up in a social welfare office, it's not enough to know who I am, but it is important to understand what are the circumstances going on within the United States or within the economy and society that led me to look for the social welfare office and need assistance from a social worker. Okay? So with that said, let me start going over the themes that we have. American Revolution was a political watershed. And what I just mean by a political watershed is just that it was a turning point in the history of the United States. Remember that the United States started as a colony of Britain, but then later, based on issues of taxes and other questions of rights, there was a revolution. Now, we know very well that after the revolution started, the country started gradually, it ended up with 13 colonies, but then, or 13 states, 13 states, but then gradually the country expanded, as we shall see in another part of this lecture. So the American Revolution was a turning point. The results of the American Revolution was a transition to a liberal capitalist society. Now, what do we mean by a liberal capitalist society? In a sense, liberal capitalist society simply means that there's a free market. People are free to sell goods and services without any restrictions. And then capitalism, is based on ownership of private property, the pursuit of profit, the guarantee of people's profit properties and things like that. Okay, so what I want to say about this, though, is that because we're looking at this between 1777 and 1860, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that American history was not moving in lockstep for everyone. What I mean by lockstep is, you remember when soldiers sometimes are parading, their steps move together. They move together in lockstep, which means they are moving together at the same pace. So even though America moved to become a liberal capitalist society, what I'm trying to draw your attention to here is that there are certain people that were not impacted by that liberal capitalist society the way others were positively impacted. And as you know very well, for instance, Native Americans, a group of people, black slaves black slaves were also people that did not initially participate in this really very freely. So even if America was liberal and capitalist, as it started moving in that direction after the revolution, it did not impact black people in the way that it impacted white people. And then, moreover, just understand that not all white people benefited from the system in the same way, because there are some whites that were not property owners, and some of them were indentured laborers, which means they came here with a commitment to work for a certain period of time and things like that. So, and then women did not have certain rights that men really have. So just understand that even though when we talk about liberal capitalist society, it's not like it is impacting all Americans at the same rate as America evolved. And then by the 19th century, the poor were increasingly cast as deviants outside normal social order and in need of reform. In other words, during the 19th century, when somebody is poor, the person is perceived as deviant. Deviant here simply means that you are not a normal person. And what I want to draw your attention to very quickly here is that throughout this course, one of the things that you're going to see is a kind of like binary debate. There's a period in time in American history where if somebody is poor, it is considered to be because of his moral failure. Moral failure here means like the person is lazy, maybe the person is alcoholic, they are not disciplined and things like that, okay? So that's the reason why somebody is considered to be poor. And so that's one kind of argument. You kind of personalize it, okay? You consider the person being responsible. On the other hand, there are people who argue that, well, when people are poor, it's not just, so you cannot understand poverty by just looking at the individual. You have to look at the system. For instance, what is the nature of the economy? How is the economy really functioning? How is the state and the economy functioning? And how have some people been excluded from the system because of that? And I think this is an issue that we're still dealing with today in the United States of America. And by that I mean, sometimes we tend to think people who are unemployed or not doing well and just assume that they are totally responsible for everything about themselves. I understand that, yes, human beings have social responsibility, but sometimes there are structural factors. Structural factors means there are Americans who are willing to work, they are hardworking, they are disciplined, but somebody wants to make a higher profit and they decided to move the job to either China or to maquiladoras in Mexico, or maybe they decided to create a new machine or buy a new machine, artificially intelligent machine that is going to replace the worker. Now, the owner of the business will make more profit by introducing the artificially intelligent machine, but the worker would have to go somewhere and start looking for a job. And if that worker probably just only had high school, and then they have been working productively for maybe 25, 30 years or more, it's not going to be easy for them to go back to school. So just understand that. And then the next thing is the powerful constructed a variety of new institutions to contain deviant populations. In other words, when these poor people are considered to be deviant, the powerful then created institutions that would take control of these poor people. And we're going to see some of those kind of institutions, such as like reformatory institutions, penitentiaries, and then almshouses where they gather them and then they put them under some disciplinary regiment of life so that they can control them in society. They don't become a threat to any person on the street. And then much of the nation, expanded democratic institutions and the operation of economic markets, but the American South moved in the opposite direction. So what are we trying to get at here? What I'm trying to draw your attention to here, and it is very important for you to understand this, is that even though America evolved, it's not like the whole of America, all the different regions of America evolved at the same pace, because as democratic institutions and the market really expanded, okay, free market capitalism expanded, especially in the Northeast, you find out that in the South, it wasn't like that. And what do I mean by it is not like that? You see, if you're really going to talk about free market capitalism the way it is written in the textbooks, like Introduction to Economic textbooks, you might say that the United States did not really become really a truly free market capitalist society probably until after segregation was abolished and people had civil rights and things like that. And what do I mean by that? In a free capitalist market, workers should be free to move around. And what I mean by workers should be free to move around, in other words, people should not be denied jobs simply because of their race. Okay? And if you have the money to buy a house, you shouldn't be denied buying the house simply because of your race. In a free market, demand and supply is what guides things, presumably. Okay? No other factor. But the reality is that when you look at the history of this country, you're going to find out that in the South, because it was slavery, and slavery says that the black person, the black slave, was a chattel. Chattel means he or she was a property. Just like if you own a car, you buy insurance for your car. Some people just invest and they buy insurance because of their slaves, because slaves were just labor. It's a very contradictory thing, and we're going to see some elements of that. What I mean by it is very contradictory is because when you look at the American Constitution, the language is very neutral. What I mean by neutral is that it doesn't say it's just a language that applies neutral to anybody. But at the same time, implicitly, there's an assumption that slavery was going to kind of continue. It was kind of like a compromise or something like that. Okay, so the issue of slavery and race became very, very important. If you really have a truly free market capitalist economy, but there's racial segregation, then that's not a true market. That's not a true free market capitalist economy, because there's no freedom of movement of labor. Okay, and then the U.S. Constitution established a new government when George Washington took the oath of office in New York as president. At that time, it was not yet Washington, D.C. So I think this is really very important at the time when George Washington became the president of the United States. And if you read his history, there's quite a lot of interesting things to understand about him. He was somebody full of humility. He wasn't somebody who is kind of concerned about accumulating power to himself during that period. It's so interesting to read about his biography. Okay, the Articles of the Confederation, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution was based on limited democratic ideals. So there are two documents that are defining to the United States at the beginning: the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Okay, now, the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that I think is very important, and many people cite that, is just that saying that we hold it to be self-evident that all human beings are born with inalienable rights. In other words, rights that cannot be alienated from this, cannot be alienated from any individual, because they are granted to that individual by his or her creator. Okay, this is a very, very fundamental concept that I want you to keep in mind. And let me digress a little bit to make a comment here to connect it with the civil rights, even though we're not there. When Martin Luther King Jr. was leading the civil rights movement, he appropriated this. And this is something that I want you to take seriously, that sometimes if you want to demand something, you want to initiate a reform, sometimes you don't even go and get values or principles outside the system and then use it to justify your argument for what you're looking for. You can use what the system claims to be and then draw arguments from what the system claims to be and then use it against the system. So Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, in some of his speeches said that the Declaration of Independence was like a promissory note. A promissory note is like a document you sign and make a commitment to somebody, like you're going to pay him something or something like that. And so with that document, when the person comes and show it to you, it's a commitment you have made, you have signed it, so you are supposed to pay the person, okay? So in the same way, Martin Luther King Jr. would say that the Declaration of Independence, when it says we hold it to be self-evident that all human beings are born with inalienable rights, rights that are granted to them by their creator, and nobody can take this away from them, okay? So he kind of put this in a very beautiful way, rhetorical flourish, very good rhetorical flourish, where he said what the civil rights struggle was people have just come to cash their check, that promissory note. Now, he's not saying, okay, I'm appropriating ideas from Russia, from China, from Britain, from France. No. He's looking at the founding documents of the United States and using it to make it like a platform for justifying the civil rights demands. So just know that the Declaration of Independence is an important document, even if we still will say that, well, it didn't, it kind of like implicitly, it didn't apply to anybody at that time because there were slaves or whatever. But the mere fact that it existed was something that became something that Martin Luther King Jr. or the civil rights movement could appropriate to make their own case. Okay, so under the founding documents, white men could vote. Okay, but even among white men, you have to be a property owner. Not every white person was qualified to vote. So just understand how our democracy started in this country. But remember also that the Native Americans were considered aliens because they were considered like dependent nations because they had their reservations or something like that. So they were separate. They were not like part of the mainstream nation. And then slaves were considered to be 3/5 of a person. So if you were a slave, you are not considered to be a full human being, but 3/5 of a person. So what does that mean in terms of understanding the early history of this country? What this simply means is that the populations that had a large concentration of states in the South, apart from counting white people as citizens, they could also count black people. Every black person was 3/5 of a human being. So that actually increased their population because you could have one person having maybe slaves over 100 or something like that. So you see that's a huge number there. So, but the interesting thing here is that on the one hand, the slave is treated as a chattel, a property, but on the other hand, he or she is counted also as 3/5 of a human being. You could see some tension in these founding documents. And then the preamble of the Constitution said promotion of the general welfare. So there's nothing mentioned about social welfare. So this idea of social welfare is something that came later in the United States. And there's a way in which it has among some people, the word social welfare has derogatory or disrespectful kind of connotations. And what do I mean by that? Let me be a little bit biographical here. There was a time I was participating in a small group. I'm a Christian and I'm participating in a small group Bible study. And we were memorizing some verses. That was when I was in graduate school. And I thought it was quite interesting because as an African immigrant, the word social welfare has dignity. There it doesn't have any kind of negative connotation or something like that. But when we were going to memorize these verses, in one of the verses, the translation of the Bible says that God is going to take care of our welfare. And one of the members of the group, who was a white person, said, no, I'm not going to memorize this verse if God is just going to take care of my welfare. So in other words, he felt like there's something, God must be able to give him something more than welfare. Welfare? No. So the pastor said, okay, that's fine. Let's look for another translation where they did not use welfare, okay? So, but welfare is a dignified concept. Dignified concept in the sense that it simply means even if I am comfortable, you are comfortable, we should feel concerned about those among us who are not doing really very well. And those people do not have to be related to us by blood, or they do not have to be our relatives or something like that. It's a commitment. And some people might think, okay, why should we care about them? Well, sociological research indicates that when you have a large number of people who are left behind, who are either feeling hungry or who are feeling kind of excluded because of social inequality or whatever, it can lead to violence in society. And when there is that kind of violence in society, because these people can be angry, then innocent people, you and I, who probably may not be poor, but can feel really very insecure because sometimes people may just do something to you just because they are looking for something to take care of themselves, okay? So that's why the concept of welfare, social welfare, I want to make the point here that some people in the United States see it as having some kind of derogatory connotation, but when you look at the literature very well, it is a manifestation of a certain level of moral and ethical evolution where you feel you need to take care of somebody who is in need, even though the person is not related to you. Okay, and the reason why, one of the implications of why the question of social welfare was not mentioned in the Constitution just talked about general welfare. One of the implications of that is that everything was left up to states. And I want to draw your attention to this also. It's a very important point because throughout this course, you're going to come across this as something very important. In the United States, we tend to have this debate between what is the relative responsibility of the federal government, the state government, and the county, okay? So there are some people who really believe that the federal government should have more power. Okay? And there are some other people who feel like, no, we don't want the government to have very much power. We want the states to have more power. And some people would even say at the county level that the state is too much domineering. They would like to have more power at the county level. Now, they give different reasons for that. But here is what I want to draw your attention to based on research. The idea that simply because a government is so decentralized, in other words, the center, like the federal government, is not powerful, that's the most efficient, or it gives more people rights and freedom or something like that. It can be true, but it is not necessarily supported by empirical research. Because when you check, you are going to find out that when the GI Bill, for instance, was passed, the language of the GI Bill or even the New Deal was just kind of like neutral. But when it was sent to the states to be implemented or to the county level, because many officials at this county level or state level were racist, they implemented this presumably neutral document. What I mean by neutral, it didn't say that only white people will get this and then black people will be treated this way. It is just supposed to apply to everyone. But actually, when you look at the way it was applied, because the people applying it had racist opinion at the local level, at the state level, they used their racist power, if you like, to exclude other people. So that's why, simply because you decentralize, it's not necessarily a guarantee. Actually, when you look at the civil rights struggle, you're going to find out that in some cases in the South, if it were not because the federal government intervened on behalf of minorities, probably the situation would not have improved as it has. Okay, and then welfare most often provide public partnership of local government and charities. So this is another thing that I would like to really emphasize also, because we're going to see that you're going to see that throughout American history, this partnership between the government and private charities has been going on. Okay? Now, this is really, really very, very important, but at some point I want to just make a small presentation about or clarification about what charity is, because we tend to emphasize charity in this country, but not only us, but in many other countries, many of the Abrahamic religious traditions. And when I say Abrahamic here, I'm talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But even in Buddhism and Hinduism, you have some teachings about charity. But we're going to see what are some of the strengths and limitations of relying on charity. Okay? So this is just an overview.